Across the span of 4 Mafia games, we've watched families rise, clash, and collapse, each era revealing a new face of organized crime in the world that it thrived in. Every entry has its own unique angle, and together they form a saga that stretches across more than half a century. The original Mafia placed us in the city of Lost Heaven during the turbulent years of 1930 to 1938, where the Salieri and Morello crime families fought a bitter war for control of that city. It was a story about loyalty, betrayal, and survival in the shadow of Prohibition's aftermath. Mafia 2 shifted the stage to Empire Bay, following Vito Scaletta between 1945 and 1951. His rise was built on the immigrant struggle, forged in the wreckage of World War II and shaped by prison walls that hardened him into a man that world just could not ignore. Mafia 3 moved the timeline forward to 1968 and transported us to New Bordeaux, a city modeled after New Orleans and drenched in the racial and social upheaval of the civil rights era. Here, Lincoln Clay's war wasn't just against the Italian mob, but against a system that had marked him, and countless others, as expendable. Hangar 13 didn't shy away from that reality, from the older veteran warning Lincoln about what coming home from war really meant.
You just come from Vietnam?
That's right.
I was a Marine in the Pacific. You take it from me. Just because you're home doesn't mean you're back. You understand? People around here, they don't get it. Never will.
And then in the Sign of the Times DLC, we're introduced to another Vietnam vet discharged for being a quote-unquote undesirable, which in other words means he was kicked out of the army for being a homosexual. I mean, really, from all angles, the game confronted prejudices of the entire era head on, with the nice cherry on top being Lincoln's PTSD and how he talks about it. But I can go on about Mafia 3 forever. So let's look at the new game, Mafia: The Old Country, where the entire timeline is reset, taking us back to 1904 to 1908 in Sicily. For the first time, we step outside the United States and witness the brutal conditions that birthed the very culture of organized crime later exported overseas. This game grounds the universe in historical truth, tying directly into roots of characters we thought we long understood and reminding us that the Mafia was never just an American story. What ties all of these games together isn't just the shifting timelines or the families we meet along the way. It's the protagonists themselves, their backgrounds, their motives, their ambitions, and the transformations they undergo throughout the progress of whatever story we're being walked through. And if you break it down, you have Tommy's desperate choices, Vito's immigrant hunger, Lincoln's righteous fury, Enzo's brutal survival. None of them are really direct one-to-one comparisons. They're all outliers in their own way, and just as importantly, each of them is introduced to the Mafia and to the various families through different circumstances. That's what makes the series so compelling, and it's what we're going to be looking at today, especially when it comes to giving Enzo a fair shot. I've seen a lot of discourse calling him a weak or poorly written protagonist. Some even outright say he's the worst we've gotten so far. I don't know if I'll go so far as to say he's the worst, because it's ultimately a matter of perspective. There's historical context all games take into account, the culture surrounding each time period, how they fit with the character, and it further develops the world all the Mafia games take place in. Some ways, Enzo's strengths stand equal with the rest, and even in certain contexts, some glaring issues pointed out within his character and evolution as a member of the Torrisi crime family actually works better than some may realize. So today, to give a little more perspective on Enzo, and to give some added context for people who haven't played all the other Mafia games, I thought it would be a good idea to briefly explore each of the series' protagonists, how they got pulled into the life, how they came across their respective families, and how their perspectives and ambitions changed over time. This isn't going to be a full deep dive into each character, more of a broad overview. But by contrasting Tommy, Vito, and Lincoln with Enzo, we can build a more balanced understanding of who he is, why he feels so different, and why some of the biggest criticism against him may not be as straightforward as some make it out to be. Out of the 4, the real outlier, I think, is always going to be Lincoln. He's the only one who was never a made man, never strove directly to earn a seat of power or command respect, and never even truly fell into a crime family the way Tommy, Vito, or Enzo did. In fact, Lincoln's story almost plays as the exact opposite. He grew up as an orphan, raised under Sammy Robinson, who was the head of the black mob, who operated under the Marcanos. That meant, by being taken in by Sammy, Lincoln from a very young age had ties, connections, and a sharp awareness of how the city really worked long before he was shipped off to fight in Vietnam. He had a firm understanding of the dynamics behind the scenes, whereas all the other characters slowly had to be let in on each family, their infrastructure, and everything that's going on. And then by the time Lincoln came back from Vietnam, he wasn't looking to restart in that life. He wasn't trying to pick right back up where he left off. He was only there to say goodbye to Sammy and Ellis before leaving. It was only once he found out that they were in a bad spot with the Haitians, which was causing Sammy to be unable to pay his kickback up to Marcanos, that he decided to intervene and help with the Haitian problem, which in turn would later lead Sal Marcano to offer Lincoln the chance to take over the Hollow from Sammy, but Lincoln would refuse out of respect for Sammy, the man who of course took him in. To Marcano, that was a confirmation. Sammy was falling behind on payments, his control over the district was slipping, and now his own surrogate son, which seemed way more competent than anyone else, rejected a path forward. So Marcano saw weakness. He made his move. The Black Mob was wiped out, the Hollow was handed to the Dixie Mafia, and Lincoln, stripped of his family and his future in one night, decided to declare war against the people that took everything from him. Now, if we look at Vito, by contrast, he takes a different path. He grew up on the streets of Empire Bay, scrapping by with petty crimes alongside his childhood friend Joe Barbaro. Eventually, he ended up getting arrested, and when the court gave him the choice between prison or the United States Army, Vito went to fight in World War II. It was ultimately a series of choices brought up by circumstance that forms the core of Vito's ambitions much later on. In 1945, when he was on medical leave, coming back to Empire Bay, he managed to get some forged discharge papers, and from there it was all about knocking on doors to establish himself within a city that he felt very much behind. By comparison, Joe had his own apartment. He was making decent money. He had nice clothes. He seemed to have all the connections and a better understanding of a type of lifestyle that can pay very adequately. With a background rooted in petty crime, small jobs, quick money, and a strong bond with his childhood friend Joe, Vito went along knocking on whatever doors he could, following Joe's moves. The only real thing Vito ultimately lacked was direction, and so did the person he was following. Vito was tied to whatever Joe knew and the direction Joe pushed him in. It was just unfortunate that he didn't know where to go or how to break into the bigger game. That would all change when Vito made a costly mistake that would land him a 10-year prison sentence. Ironically, that mistake became his turning point because inside of prison, Vito met Leo Galante, the consigliere of the Vinci crime family. Leo would come to see something within Vito, and he gave him everything he needed: structure, guidance, and most importantly, the connections and understanding of what the hell he's doing. From that moment forward, Vito wasn't just a street kid chasing quick scores anymore. He was someone with leverage, stronger, much more powerful and experienced connections, and an overall path forward. Mafia 2 also does something really special here. It zooms out and shows us how all the pieces within Empire Bay fit together. How the three Mafia families carved out their own territories, constantly butting heads, making deals, and trying to outmaneuver each other behind the scenes, and then coming together, forming the spine of the commission. Through Vito's eyes, we start to understand the bigger picture, the politics, the rivalry, and the rules of what the hell it means to slowly become part of what he was always chasing. Tommy's introduction to the life is in a lot of ways the closest parallel we have to Enzo's. He wasn't a criminal looking to climb the ranks or a soldier chasing power outright. He was just a cab driver, out late one night trying to make a living. That's when everything changed. Paulie Lombardo and Sam Trapani, Soldados in the Salieri crime family, were in trouble. They'd been ambushed by Morello's men. Their car was wrecked, and their only chance of escape was the cab Tommy happened to be driving. Sam pulled a gun on him and forced him behind the wheel. Suddenly, Tommy went from an ordinary night on the job to being the wheelman in a Mafia shootout. The chase was chaotic and desperate. Bullets tore through his cab, glass shattered, and every second on the road pushed Tommy further away from that quiet life he thought he had. He managed to get them back safely to Salieri's bar and out of reach of Morello's men, and for that he was paid for the damages and thanked for his help. Even told that in the future, if he wants a job, he knows where to find them. The money Tommy was paid for helping Paulie and Sam was enough to make him think about their offer, but the real decision came the next day, and it really wasn't his to make. While Tommy was on break, Morello's men tracked him down. They smashed up his new cab, beat him, and would have killed him right there on the spot if he hadn't managed to escape. He ran, desperately, straight to Salieri's bar. That bar was considered untouchable. Even though Morello and Salieri's crew was already trading blows in the streets, All-out warfare hadn't been declared yet. Each family still somewhat respected the unwritten rules that home turf was off limits, and so by crossing into Salieri's territory, Tommy found safety. From there, he was brought before Don Salieri himself. The Don would offer him a loan to replace his destroyed cab, but Tommy turned it down. Instead, he asked for something differently: permission to strike back at the men who had beaten him and taken his livelihood. It was part gratitude, part revenge, and part survival instinct, aligning himself with the people who had already looked out for him when he had nowhere else to turn. Even starting from such humble beginnings, just a cab driver in the depths of the Great Depression, Tommy still had more than Enzo ever did, because Enzo's story begins in a much darker place. He was sold off at 5 years old to cover for his father's debts, forced into hard labor that was little better than slavery, and by the time we meet him in 1904, Enzo is 17. He spent the last 12 years saving every coin he could, keeping it secret from everyone else out of fear that it might be stolen, with the hope of one day buying back his freedom. That determination drove him, but it also shaped him into something very differently than Tommy, Vito, or Lincoln. Where they had choices, even if they were bad ones, Enzo had nothing. His entire childhood was defined by brutal work, by being treated as less than nothing. Food was often denied to him until he finally reached a breaking point, sneaking or stealing whatever scraps he could just to survive. That kind of upbringing carved out the core of who he was. His naivety isn't weakness, it's the result of a childhood where survival meant keeping your head down, and opportunity wasn't something you chased, it was something you prayed one day you might have. Raised under the thumb of the Spadaro underbosses, Enzo grew up with a very real hatred towards men like El Merlo and Leombra as well. And honestly, that's what makes his introduction to Don Torrisi one of the strongest openings we've seen for any family within the series. When Enzo lashes out and cuts El Merlo's face in the mines, the historical weight matters. If you look at the Bastoni brothers, their reputation for violence was infamous. Enzo's attack wouldn't have just been brushed off. It would have been punished severely, torture, and most likely his death. That's the level of cruelty he was up against. But then Don Torrisi steps in, and not only does he save Enzo, he lets him stand his ground in front of Il Merlo, who had probably never been forced to take that kind of disrespect in his entire life. If Il Merlo had ever had to bite his tongue, it most likely would have only come from Don Spadaro himself. Anyone else would have paid for their defiance later, either them or the ones closest to them, or even if it was from Spadaro, there's no telling if Il Merlo wouldn't have managed some type of way to take it out on the Torrisi later. But once Torrisi makes his position clear, Il Merlo can't do anything. He has to shut up, swallow his pride, and walk away empty-handed, because behind the scenes, the Spadaros and the Torrisis are already on an uneasy sort of truce. It's precisely because of that uneasy truce that Don Torrisi shows such a sign of force. He can't, and won't, allow even a hint of weakness, because men like the Spadaros, much like Torrisi and Tino, only understand violence. If the threat of war needs to be raised over a single runaway mine boy, so be it. Because the truth was, the Spadaro clan couldn't even keep their so-called property under control, and they crossed into a border they had no right to chase him into. Enzo, of course, didn't realize any of this at the time, and maybe he never fully grasped the deeper meaning behind Torrisi saving him. Whatever his understanding was, though, it pales in comparison to the contrast between how Torrisi treated him versus the Spadaros. Again, his tormentor, El Merlo, is forced to bend the knee, told outright that Enzo's protected and off limits. And then Enzo's given things he's never had in his entire life. A private room, his own bed, fresh clothes, shoes, honest work, and food. Yes, he's still called a Kurusu and treated like an outsider, but we can't forget he's undoubtedly counting his blessings behind the scenes. So do we really have to ask why he's so grateful? Why he's always willing to pay Torrisi back for saving his life? At 17 years old, having lived as a slave for over a decade, Enzo didn't have the luxury of perspective. Today, with social media, books, TV, games, we're constantly reminded of what the world has to offer. We have this wealth of knowledge that dwarfs even the generation before many of us. And in Enzo's time, he didn't know any of that. All he knew was hunger, exhaustion, and the hope of just making it the next day. That kind of life gives you tunnel vision. And the moment someone opens that tunnel even slightly, it feels like salvation. For Enzo, Teresi's protection wasn't just a lifeline, it was the best future he could have ever imagined. And for him, it actually extends directly into the next point. Calling Enzo robotic or saying he's just always reactive, it actually fits him. And more than that, it fits the story Hangar 13 wanted to tell. Enzo's passivity isn't a flaw so much as a lens. Through him, we get to see how the much more experienced, aggressive, and ambitious people around him conduct themselves and do business. He's a contrast, not a copy. That's why I don't think it's fair to call him a bad character simply because he wanted to stay with the family, only to then later change course and dream of America because Isabella wanted it. On the surface, sure, yeah, I can feel like that, as it does feel a little sudden, but look deeper and it makes sense. Enzo never wanted power for power's sake. What he wanted was a place to belong, to earn that spot, to completely shave off this title of being an outsider. And for a time, he believed he'd found it under Don Teresi. But the pressure of becoming a father, the guilt of going behind the Don's back, and the trauma of watching his closest ally and mentor die, a man whose last words were begging for God's forgiveness and pleading for Enzo to leave, if he can, all of that hit him at once. Isabella's words, her dream of leaving, can come back to him in that moment, and that was the real turning point. For a kid who lived hard, fast, and without choices for so long, the switch tracks, it works. It may not be as flashy or commanding as Tommy, Vito, or Lincoln, but it's consistent with who Enzo is, and the life that he was forced to live. So here I think the better comparison for Enzo isn't Lincoln or Vito at all, it's purely Tommy. Because Lincoln and Vito were soldiers. They were trained to kill and trained to separate themselves from whoever was on the other side of the gun. Vito even explains this very well to Luca Guarino.
I'm talking about taking somebody out. Just because someone points his finger at him and tells you to do it.
I was in the war, Mr. Guarino. All I did was kill people I was told to kill. People the president pointed his finger at.
And then Lincoln? He's another beast entirely. This is someone who was trained very well in psychological warfare. He weaponized fear just as much as bullets. Everybody he left behind in New Bordeaux wasn't just a casualty, it was an omen. A warning sign to Sal Marcano of what was coming, and a promise that nothing can stop it. Lincoln's war was as much about terror as it was about blood, and an eye for an eye. Tommy couldn't have been any further from any of that. He didn't have that military background, and because of it, his story gives us those moments where the weight of violence really takes a toll on him. When Sarah, Luigi's daughter, a woman that Tommy also has feelings for, was harassed on Don Salieri's own territory, in response to this, Salieri would send Tommy, Paulie, and Sam to find the people responsible for harassing Sarah and basically just beat them. It was meant to be a stern warning that nobody was allowed to mess with any of Salieri's own people on his own territory. But when the people responsible for Sarah's harassment pulled weapons, it turned into a kill or be killed type of situation, which would eventually lead to a car chase. The driver of said car would eventually crash his vehicle, giving Paulie and Tommy the perfect opportunity to kill all men within the vehicle. But Tommy would freeze. The kid begging for his life was just too much. He couldn't pull the trigger, so Paulie had to finish the job while Tommy stood there. Sometime later, when Sam was shot on what was supposed to be just a routine job, Tommy was rattled to his core. The look in his eyes said it all, the 1,000-yard stare of someone realizing just how deep into this world he's gone. A world where nothing was as safe or as straightforward as it seemed. And by the time he, Paulie, and Sam were ordered to kill Don Morello, in order to finally conclude the war between both families, Tommy had crossed that line completely. He emptied a full Thompson magazine into Don Morello with a blank expression, seemingly even unsettling Paulie. It appeared as if Tommy's humanity was worn down by the war and just the toll of this life. The cab driver who had once struggled to pull the trigger on a seemingly innocent kid was now killing a Don without thinking. There's a progression. There's a real internal struggle that you see Tommy go through. Despite Enzo not being a trained killer or having any sort of obviously military or seemingly any firearm background, and because he doesn't get these moments that shake him really, at least not like Tommy that rattles him to his core. Yes, he does react from the deaths of Luca and Gaetano, absolutely, so that does mean he's not numb. But we can't deny there's a side of his development that is lacking. He doesn't have those moments. He doesn't freeze or stumble or question why doing certain things. And a lot of people point to that as a flaw. Why does this kid who spent his entire life in a mine have no problem picking up a gun and killing? But in the context of his story, it can flip either way, and it would be something that would be more easily defendable had it not been for this scene right here. Enzo's being trained by Luca on how to properly defend himself in a knife fight against rival family members. A very event he knew would arise on account of what Enzo is pursuing. And I do want to point out, Enzo does say he's gotten into knife fights before, and we did see him technically beat El Merlo back at the mine, but anything else is just whatever we can speculate on in terms of what he meant by saying he has further experience in knife fights. But his loss to Luca, to me, says more about how long-established members within the families would naturally be more skilled than Enzo. Guys like Luca, El Merlo, Leombra, they weren't just thugs, they were veterans of the 1896 war between the families. Men like that would easily best someone like Enzo in a knife fight. That doesn't make Enzo weak, it just highlights the gap between someone forced into servitude and men hardened by decades of bloodshed. And when you take his background into account, being left to suffer by his own family, his father, and growing up under the cruelty of the Spadados, that could explain Enzo developing tunnel vision, having this survivalist type of mentality of it's me or them, which could justify why he doesn't freeze up like Tommy did, why he doesn't hesitate when it comes to killing, or have that internal struggle. For Enzo, once the line in the sand is drawn between you and him, there seems to be no hesitation, no second guessing. You act or you die, and that could be traced all the way back to the mines. That said, the game could have handled this better. Even a small scene where Enzo confesses to Father Ciccone or admits something to Isabella, that would have gone a long way. A throwaway line of him saying he never thought he'd be killing for a family, or that he feels guilt but pushes it aside because he needs to achieve Don Teresi's trust, something which he constantly brings up to Isabella. Just a little acknowledgement that he does feel something. Even if he buries it out of loyalty and necessity, that would have gone a long way. The firearms proficiency, though, is it's harder to defend. It's strange. The first time Luca hands him a gun, he hesitates like it's foreign to him, which would make sense. In early 1900s Sicily, outside of the Mafia, few would have had much exposure to firearms. I could imagine Enzo as a Kurusu under the Spadados at least seeing weapons or maybe being around them when guards use them to enforce order, but to handle them as smoothly as he does, a little bit of a stretch. Honestly, it would have made more sense if Enzo showed fear or uncertainty around guns at first before growing into it. Instead, the game skips that progression, but that does then bring up the question of, do we really need everything spelled out? Maybe not. What matters is that the brutality of his upbringing gave him the ability to act without thinking, and when it counted, that more than technical firearm proficiency is what defines him. Which goes back to just what this game sets out to try to accomplish. It's not just telling Enzo's story, it's expanding the overall world of the Mafia series. And it does so in a way that doesn't contradictory erase what the previous 3 games already established. That's not easy to pull off. Prequels are always difficult because you're writing inside of a box. You already know where the future leads, which means you can't let certain characters or events overshadow what's to come, what's already been established. Every choice has to feel authentic without breaking continuity. I think that's exactly what Hangar 13 was aiming for here. Much of the game feels like a course correction after Mafia 3. Don't get me wrong, Mafia 3 did a lot of things right. The civil rights backdrop, the rawness of Lincoln's story, the weight of systemic racism. But it was also criticized for its repetition, its structure, and the way the open world didn't always match the series' more focused storytelling roots. This game grounds the series again, not in sprawling open world design, but in the foundation of the families themselves. It's less about one man's rise and fall and more about showing how this entire culture of crime first took root in Sicily, and how those roots stretched across the ocean into the United States. Enzo, again, is that lens, with a real focus being on the Galantes, the Trapanis, the Spadaros, and the smuggling networks that would later feed into the stories of Tommy, Vito, and Lincoln. If you played Mafia the Old Country, I'd really like to hear your thoughts on Enzo. What stood out to you about him? His strengths, his weaknesses? And overall, what do you think this game actually got right? Tomorrow I'll be talking about the ending of the game, breaking it down and giving some further context behind it and what it could mean for the series overall. And later this week, I've got videos coming on the much requested Don Teresi, Tino, and the Bastoni brothers. So if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss those character breakdowns and histories. Thank you for sticking around to the very end. It really does mean a lot. I'm curious what you think about Luca Trapani, his position within the Torrisi crime family, and how things might have been differently had he survived. I do have another video coming out specifically on his death, but I do want to wait on major spoilers for the game right now. So subscribe for some future Mafia content, for analysis, breakdowns, and overall backstories. And a major shout out to my patrons, Konkin, Daniel Homan, John Cooper, and Ryan Smith. It's thanks to you that I'm able to spend so much time and go as detailed in these videos as possible. If you want to support the channel directly as well and get some behind the scenes or exclusive content on myself, the channel overall, and just how these videos are put together, then consider checking out the Patreon. Link is down in the pinned comment.